Good evening. In the previous episodes, we spoke of the intellectual movements that grew up and agitated 19th century Russia, where reformist and revolutionary ideas could be roughly classified under two labels: the Westernizers and the Slavophiles. And we also gave some details about the life of Alexander Herzen, one of quite a few noblemen who left Russia as self-exiles and attempted to spread the reformist message without fears of being arrested and sent to hard labor in Siberia if they had remained in Russia. Arrest and exile happened to Herzen himself and to others, including Dostoevsky, whose death sentence was commuted literally minutes before being shot by the execution squad. It would be impossible to talk about all the important Russian thinkers who prepared the ground for the 1917 revolution. And furthermore, I suggest an analogy, namely that history can be compared to a multi-layered cake, where each one of the layers contributes to the overall structure and taste of the cake itself. But to continue with the analogy, the problem is that the layers do not lie independently and neatly each on its own plane. No, the layers mix and interact with each other in different ways and combinations, and often unpredictably. Sometimes they mix, sometimes they separate, sometimes they don't even seem to belong to the same cake. All of this makes it impossible for anybody, a student or even an academic perhaps, to give us an account precise enough to be considered definite or definitive. There are exceptions, of course, but these general conditions apply at large. And this is why, and I know I said this before in previous episodes, this is why history is continuously being rewritten, and any historian cannot help but seeing history through the lens of the present. Among the protagonists of 19th century Russian thinkers in this episode, I quite arbitrarily chose to talk about two. One is Vissarion Belinsky, and the other is Nikolai Chernyshevsky. Belinsky was born in what is now Finland, and unlike many or most of the Russian intellectuals of the time, he was not a wealthy aristocrat. He was mostly self-educated after having been expelled from Moscow University for his political activity. He was a true romantic, and one of his sayings was, "For me to think, to feel, to understand, and to suffer are one and the same thing." He crossed all the stages of ideological development, starting with enthusiasm for ideas, which was typical of the Russian cultural circles of the time. Then he studied the major German philosophers of the time, and then he was influenced by French literature and socialist thought. Belinsky was the ancestor of a type of literary critic who would play an immense part in the history of Russian thought and intelligentsia. Intelligentsia characterized by a search for an integral outlook that would give an answer to all questions of life. This integration would unite all theoretical and practical reasons and give a philosophical basis to social ideas. We could say good luck, we may say. I realize that it seems impossible that actual revolutions, bloodless or otherwise, may be traced to ideas as abstract as giving a philosophic basis to social ideas, but this is how reality is. And to deviate very briefly from the theme of the episode, all this current business of gay marriages, transgenderism, universalism, globalism, the emphasis on the family, and I may add, promotion of miscegenation, is the result of the intellectual movement that trails back to the school of so-called cultural Marxism. Therefore, if I invite you to think about people who wanted to give a philosophical basis to social ideas, it is only that Belinsky and many more like him with a speculative frame of mind constitute the layer of the historical cake, to recall the analogy, that led to the revolution of 1917. Belinsky was primarily a literary critic, not a politician or even a philosopher. However, we must keep in mind that Russian social thought was concealed under the form of literary criticism simply because, with the censorship that existed, it could not otherwise have been represented. One of the most admired and studied German philosophers of the time was Hegel. Now, in my view, to read Hegel, the reader must be in perfect conditions of physical and mental health. However rough and non-academic, here let me give you the 1-minute Hegel. Hegelianism can be shrunk into the following statement. The rational alone is real, that is, all reality is capable of being expressed in rational categories. And this will probably leave most of you quite cold, because we cannot undertake the elaborate thought required by Hegel to distinguish the rational from the irrational, and eventually leading to his rational categories. Still, some may remember Hegel as being associated with the business of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Again, a business that will leave cold most of us who are not professional philosophers. But here is the example of liberty of which all of us have an idea, at least. To know what liberty really is, we must go through a 3-stage sequence. The first stage is to find the place where originally the concept is applied. In the instance, the freedom of the savage, who does not feel the need of expressing or repressing, rather, any thought, feeling, or impulse to act. In the second stage, the savage gives up his freedom in exchange for its opposite, the restraint, or as what is for him the tyranny of civilization and law. In the third and final stage, the citizen, living under the rule of law, discovers that liberty has a higher and more comprehensive meaning than the savage's interpretation, which also means being able to do many more things than the savage could do. Now, the funny thing, if funny is the right adjective, is that Hegelianism justifies both conservatism and revolution. Hegel, for example, was the philosopher of the Prussian state, in which Hegel saw the development of what he called the absolute spirit. But at the same time, the same original set of ideas led eventually to Marx and Marxism. In fact, the early Russian Hegelians interpreted Hegel conservatively, we could say, meaning that one must reconcile himself to the actual environment and see reason in the environment where he lives. And this was the period of Tsar Nicholas. Now, both Belinsky and Bakunin, famous and quintessential anarchist, went through this stage of, as I said, conservative Hegelianism. But then, through the influence of the Romantic movement, the Romantic idealists escaped from the social conditions into the world of thought, of imagination, of literature, and generally the world of ideas. And since literature sometimes is better than life at telling us what life is, we find the perfect expression of the Romantic Hegelian in Turgenev's novel Diary of a Superfluous Man, or in the character of Rudin, another of Turgenev's novels. If you read them, you will sense the pulse of pre-revolutionary Russia, Romantic Russia, better than I could ever be able to do with a historical sketch. But it was not the end. Now, Belinsky and others rejected Hegelianism completely, at least for a few years, until the advent of Karl Marx, who, Karl Marx, interpreted Hegel in a revolutionary sense. Influenced by these ideas, Belinsky turned to revolutionary socialism and militant atheisms. Lots of isms. There are lots of isms when you study Russian history. The conflict for the value of individual human personality resolved itself into a conflict for a socialist structure of society. Said it another way, Belinsky rebels against an abstract idealism remote from concrete life, which sacrifices the individual to the general, the living human being to the world soul. And this is what he says in a writing addressed to Hegel in quite an argumentative tone. With all due respect to your philosophical Philistinism, etc., etc., I do not want happiness even as a gift unless I have peace of mind about my brothers by blood. They say that disharmony is a condition of harmony. Maybe that is very pleasant and consoling for lovers of music, but it is certainly not so for those who face disharmony in their experience. In this sense, Belinsky anticipated Dostoevsky's argument treated in The Legend of the Great Inquisitor, and perhaps Dostoevsky had Belinsky in mind when he writes about the thoughts of Ivan Karamazov in perhaps his most famous novel. In the end, Belinsky became a revolutionary, an atheist, and a socialist. An atheist in particular because he could not reconcile himself with the idea of God, given the evil and suffering of human life. We see in Belinsky the moral and psychological sources of Russian socialism, as well as a paradox. Belinsky rebels against general ideas for the sake of the individual, but then he engages himself into a fight for general ideas in order to establish a social organization for humanity. Therefore, starting from rejecting general social theories that did not take care of the individual, he ended up paradoxically with a new general theory, that is socialism, or socialism as a general idea. But this general idea was important for the sake of the individual personality. And another of his quotes was, what is to me that the general idea is around when the individual suffers, he used to say. Belinsky's love of humanity can be compared to the same love of humanity that Marat displayed during the French Revolution. Marat, as you remember, was one of the most radical Republican voices, calling for violent action and murder against the more moderate voices of the revolution, and ending up by being assassinated himself in his bath by the counter-revolutionary famous Carlotte Corday. In a similar vein, Belinsky said, "I become terrible when I get some mystical absurdity or other in my head." And these are remarkable words because we see the powers by which, starting from a sympathy for mankind, Belinsky ends up preaching tyranny and brutality. Here is the cornerstone of the paradox. There must be blood to bring about happiness. To bring happiness to the greater part of mankind, it was necessary to physically eliminate hundreds of thousands. And in this sense, Belinsky was a forerunner of what we can call Bolshevik morals. According to which, Bolshevik morals that is, people are so stupid that they must be dragged to happiness by force. If I had been a Tsar, Belinsky said, I would have been a tyrant on behalf of justice, aiming for the day when there would be no rich and no poor. Now, Belinsky is a central figure in the history of Russian thought and of the self-consciousness of the 19th century. He is an intellectual ancestor of Russian communism and one of its predecessors, certainly more than Herzen, because whom we saw in the last episode. In Belinsky, we can observe the motives that gave birth to the general outlook of life of the Russian intelligentsia in the 19th century. And this outlook remained dominant and finally produced Russian communism, though in a different historical setting. These motives are a passionate, indignant protest against evil, violence, and suffering of life, and in sympathy with the unhappy, the destitute, and the downtrodden. In the communist view, the problem of society finally replaces the problem of man. And revolution does away with general philosophical ideas that did little for the individual oppressed person. But it makes the same person subject to a new general philosophical idea, to a society which demands for itself the complete submission of man, which is the end of the line for all religious, socialist and atheistic thought. And in this context, even those who have not read or followed the development of communism may have heard at times that communism is or was akin to religion, for its foundation was a love of justice. In the previous episode, we saw how Herzen came to Western Europe expecting to find socio-political solutions applicable to Russia and ended up disgusted with the West. He found that the Russian peasantry, yes, it lived in conditions of serfdom and was devoid of the most elementary enlightenment, but Herzen saw in the peasantry a greater expression of the principle of personality, greater than in the European who had become completely bourgeois. Herzen, the moderate, had a kind of metaphysical faith in the root nature of the Russian soul, without much regard about how this positiveness, if we can call it this way, how this positiveness could translate into practice. Belinsky, the radical, sought instead the happiness of the downtrodden, irrespective of how many should be slaughtered for that happiness to come by. Another school of thought, parallel but different from radical socialism, which found its expression in the 1917 revolution, was the anarchist movement. But we should also talk about the nihilists, another layer in the multi-layered pie of 19th century Russia. Given the time limits, I will give you a concise definition of the difference. In philosophy, nihilism asserts that objective truth does not exist. In politics, nihilism asserts that society has degenerated so far that all remedy is impossible. Therefore, the only sensible thing to do is to destroy everything and see what happens naturally. Anarchists do not necessarily advocate destroying everything. They would be happy enough if the government would declare itself extinct and go home. Now, regarding nihilism, it was not a social movement per se, but perhaps the best way to get an idea of the nihilists is to read the classic novel Fathers and Sons by Turgenev, and make a point of noticing the behavior of the character Bazarov, who is considered the central figure of the novel. He embodies the central idea of nihilism and represents the new generation against which the older characters of traditional beliefs react. Dostoevsky used to say, "We are all nihilists." Nihilism denied God, the soul, the spirit, ideas, standards, and the highest values. But yet, nihilism must be recognized as a religious phenomenon. It grew up, we could say, in the spiritual soil of orthodoxy. It is an orthodox asceticism turned inside out. Because Russian nihilism reflects the orthodox rejection of the world, and the truth that, to use a biblical reference, the whole world lies in wickedness. It was an individualist movement, but it was directed against anything that may be considered a form of show, of ostentation. Nihilists would not do too well today in today's Hollywood for sure. Hence, not only riches and luxury were sins, but even art, metaphysical, spiritual values, religion are also luxury and therefore sinful. Nihilism is devoted to the emancipation of earthly man, the freeing of the laboring people from excessive suffering, and is dedicated to establishing conditions of happy life, to the destruction of superstition and prejudice and conventional standards which enslave man and are obstacles to his happiness. It is a revolt against the injustice of history and against what is perceived as a false civilization. Paradoxically, the intellectual asceticism of nihilism found expression in materialism, more isms. And materialism was turned into a peculiar set of dogmatic theology, which is a characteristic of the materialism of the communists. In fact, the fanatical circles of the left Russian intelligentsia, if you like, created a catechism for the materialists. If you were not a materialist, then you were in favor of the enslavement of man, both intellectually and politically. Materialism was turned into an idol and a faith, and the nihilists, like the early Christian martyrs, were ready to sacrifice themselves and went to forced labor and the gallows in droves, literally in droves. They did not understand the mystery of the Christian cross, but were capable of extreme sacrifice themselves, as I said. It was not by chance that seminarists, children of the clergy, and people taught in the Orthodox school played a large part in Russian nihilism. A notable representative of the nihilists was Nikolai Chernyshevsky, who wrote a utopian novel called What Is to Be Done, and this became a sort of textbook of Russian nihilism. As it was observed by a Russian theologian, What Is to Be Done is actually an ascetic book and a manual of the devout life of Russian nihilists. Chernyshevsky's asceticism and the practical Christian virtues of this materialism, if you like, provided, we could say, an immense endowment of moral capital on which the communists lived, even if they did not possess those virtues. Another important Russian movement, along with the nihilism and anarchism, had the Russian name of Narodnichetsvo, and its practitioner his believers were called Narodniks. Herzen, Dostoevsky, Bakunin, and Tolstoy were all Narodniks, though in different ways. Narodnichetstvo is essentially a belief in the Russian people, but the people, in this view, refer to the simple laboring people, especially the peasantry. Russian Narodsky believed that among the people was preserved the secret of the true life, a secret concealed from the governing cultured classes. And in this respect, the intelligentsia was not a function of the life of the people. It was broken off from that life and felt guilty in relation to the people. And this sense of guilt plays a great part in the psychology of the Narodnichetstvo. The religious Narodniks, that is, the Slavophiles, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and others, believed that in the people was hidden religious truth. The non-religious Narodniks, on the other hand, like Herzen and Bakunin, believed that in the people was hidden social as opposed to religious truth. The Narodnichetstvo of the Slavophile religious type saw the chief guilt of the cultured and upper classes in their divorce from the religious belief of the people and from the people's life. The Narodnichetstvo of the socialist type saw the guilt of the cultured classes in the fact that their life and culture was founded upon the exploitation of people's labor. The Russian Narodnichetstvo had its root in the reforms of Peter the Great more than 100 years before, and it is a product of the consciousness of the intelligentsia that their own life could not be justified. That is, it was absurd and outside of Russian life as a whole. And this is important, unusual, and we could say very Russian. No people in the West has ever felt the sense of repentance as the Russians as represented by their privileged classes. And it gave rise to the unique type of the contrite noble, conscious of the sin of his social position, and he repented of it. The upper-class Narodniks were moved especially by motives of conscience, whereas the lower-class Narodsky were moved by motives of honor. In common, they had an aversion for the bourgeoisie and the dread of the development of capitalism, which has always been a distinctive character of the Russian people. They believed in a path of development for Russia which included the possibility of escaping Western capitalism. And they also believed that the Russian people are predestined to solve the social problems better and more quickly than the West. One of the chief supporters of Narodnik socialism was the fact that the Russian conception of property was always alien to the Russian people, which seems absurd, but it is not. The absolute nature of private property as we intended more or less here in the West, was or had been alien to them. What was important was not one's attitude to the principle of property, but one's attitude to the living man, which, if you like, was in the end the Christian position. All the Narodniks idealized the peasants' commune, and it seemed to them an original product of Russian history, that is, the highest type of development considering the condition of the peasants. After the abolition of servitude carried out by Tsar Alexander, there was established a system of administration called the Zemstvo, that is a system of elected councils established to administer local affairs. But soon there was a wave of reactionary repression, which in turn aroused a revolutionary temper and activity. And this was a vicious cycle. And the most important representative of this period was Sergei Nekaev, a radical among the radicals, who composed himself a revolutionary catechism, which is a mix of orthodox asceticism with a revolutionary and the Stoic denial of the world. Nekaev anticipated, to a large extent, the Bolshevik type of party organization in which everything comes from above, the extreme of centralized and despotic organization, as Bolshevism proved to be in the end. It was Nekaev who inspired Dostoevsky to write The Possessed, using the main character of the novel as a kind of caricature of Nekaev. In essence, as the 19th century advanced toward its end, the intellectual waters of Russia were reaching the boiling point. Time is running out, and I covered less than I wished to. I will have one more episode dedicated to the biography of one of the most important characters, but I hope I have given you at least a flavor of the intellectual turmoil and currents that were leading Russia to the abyss of the 1917 revolution and associated mayhem and bloodbath. Thank you for watching, and until next time, I am Jim Emoliev, and for Historical Sketches, good night.